From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub Podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Good morning, security gang. Welcome to another episode of the CyberHub Podcast, Thursday, February 20th, 2025. Back in the studio. I'm going to try to hold it together on today's show. I've got something to talk about at the very end. I will talk about that in a little bit. But before we do that, join me for a coffee cup cheers this morning. I've got my double espresso. I hope you're enjoying yours. Coffee cup cheers, y'all. Lots to talk about in the world of cyber and beyond, because guess what? There is a world beyond cyber security. And today's show will touch on that. I will get through the cyber news. We'll touch on that stuff at the very end here. So those who want to stick around can. All right, so let's kick off with Palo Alto warning that a file read vulnerability, that's CVE 2025-0111, is now being chained in attacks with two additional flaws that exist in the Pan OS firewall, and it's being used in active attacks. So the two other chained CVEs are CVE 2025-0108 and CVE 2024-90474. They're disclosing that the authentication bypass vulnerability 0108 on February 12th. Now, and then obviously CVE 90474 could be chained together with 0108. Chained together, they gain root privileges on unpatched Pan OS firewalls. A day later, Gray Noise reported that threat actors have begun exploiting the flaws, with attempts coming from two different IP addresses that they were able to track. But all three together create a perfect dish for attackers in order to infiltrate your Palo Alto Pan OS systems. So one, Palo's urging everyone to patch those ASAP. That's the right move. Now, you've got to be able to patch at least 2 out of the 3 to mitigate the attack. Meaning, if for whatever reason you haven't patched CVE 2024-90474, because it is pretty old and it is being exploited as a 0-day, but let's say for whatever reason you've mitigated it in whatever purpose. But whatever mitigation you did, chained with 0108 and 0111, creates the perfect storm. So you got to patch the other 2 in order to try to mitigate the 90474. But because it's a 0-day, you can't really mitigate it unless you patch it. So again, make sure you get this stuff patched up. Exploitation activity is increasing. It went from 2 IPs to 25 different IPs targeting these various CVEs on Palo Alto. Researchers said that when considering all 3 flaws chained together, 65% or 2,200 devices still remain vulnerable to them all, primarily in the US, India, Thailand, China, and Mexico in the top 5. And you obviously see there the top 10, and that list here goes very, very long, about 35 with, you know, a few in Poland, Mozambique, and Ecuador. So just you want to make sure you get these patched up as soon as possible. The organizations have given federal agencies until March 11th to patch it, because these vulnerabilities have been added to the CISO catalog. And so make sure you get these patched up. And by the way, if you can't, for whatever reason, get a patch deployed, you need to really reach out to the vendor. I had someone comment a few days ago as we were talking about vulnerabilities. Well, we can't really deploy the patch. We're having all these issues. My reply was, have you reached out to the vendor? And they go, we're not getting answers. And I go, well, then turn tables over. I turn tables over when I can't get answers. Just call the CEO. Pick up the phone, call the CEO and say, I'm not getting the support I need from your team to do the work I hired you and pay you to do. Can I please get some help? Timely. Thank you. There's that. Microsoft also informing customers that it had patched a Power Pages vulnerability that's being exploited in attack. Power Pages is essentially a low-code SaaS platform designed for creating, hosting, and managing business websites. It's kind of their version of it. CVE 2025-249-89 was described as a critical improper access control issue that would allow an attacker to elevate privileges over a network, potentially bypassing the user registration control. Customers do not need to install these patches simply because it's a SaaS-hosted type of service, but some users could check their instances for signs of compromise in the event they deem something seeming suspicious. But Microsoft in these cases typically deploys the patch themselves. That's good on Microsoft. Again, one of those things is there. Horizon 3 is releasing technical details on 4 critical severity vulnerabilities that impacted Ivanti's endpoint manager, along with a proof of concept code that was targeting them. The security defects are CVEs 2024-10811, 13161, 13160, and 13159 all have a CVSS score of 9.8. It's an absolute path traversal issue. These were patched in mid-January in version 2024 and 2022 SU6. Sorry, Ivanti warned at the time that the flaws could be exploited to leak sensitive information, but didn't provide additional details. Now those details are readily available. They're noting that the 4 vulnerabilities can be exploited to relay credentials to an LDAP and add a machine account. An attacker can then add delegation rights to the new account, impersonate a domain admin for CIFS services, and then validate those permissions. The vulnerabilities were reported back in October of 2024. Ivanti took about 3 months to patch those into mid-January. And if you're still got Ivanti in your system, as I like to say on the show, you glut for punishment. You're gluing for punishment. Rip and replace. If there was ever a case to be made to rip and replace, Ivanti is that case. On Tuesday, developers of OpenSSH, an open source implementation of the Secure Shell Protocol, rolled out patches for 2 different vulnerabilities, one exploitable without any user interaction, the other without any sort of authentication. They use a client-server system. OpenSSH provides support for encrypted communication. It's used across many modern enterprises. The first of the newly addressed vulnerabilities is CVE 2025-26465. It impacts the OpenSSH client with the Verify Host Key DNS option enabled and can be exploited using a man-in-the-middle attacker to impersonate a server. According to Qualys, which identifies this CVE, the flaw can be successfully exploited regardless of the Verify Host Key DNS option in use, without user interaction, and even if the SSH FP resource record does not exist. So there's that. And if attacker can perform this man-in-the-middle attack, the client may accept the attacker's key instead of a legitimate one. According to Qualys, there's that. The second bug that they're resolved impacts both the client and server and can be exploited without any authentication to cause a denial of service condition through asymmetric consumption of memory and CPU resources. An attacker could repeatedly exploit this to cause a prolonged outage, preventing both administrators and end users from using OpenSSH. OpenSSH version 9.9 P2 was released on Tuesday, and it fixes both of those CVEs. Cloud Software Group released critical security updates to address a high severity vulnerability in the NetScaler Council and NetScaler Council agent. Those are identified as CVEs 2024-12284. The vulnerability would allow an authenticated malicious actor to execute commands without additional authorization. Again, so it's a high complexity attack. It's not a low complexity attack because they need to be an authenticated actor. So if they're not authenticated on your network, they're not authenticated on your system, it doesn't impact the NetScaler part of it. The vulnerability discovered in both the council and the agent are essentially components for managing and monitoring NetScaler devices and services. So Cloud Software Group has rated the vulnerability with a high CVSS score of 8.8, indicating it's a serious threat that needs immediate attention. So according to the primary risk lies in the potential for unauthorized command execution. But again, the user would need to be authenticated. So identity always remains at the perimeter. So when you look at these things, they always tend to have kind of like this exaggeration. It doesn't have that. You can see the new versions here on the screen. I'll have those in our show notes as well. You can check them out there at cyberhubpodcast.com. CISA and FBI said attackers deploying Ghost ransomware breached victims from over 70 different countries, including some critical infrastructure organizations. Industries like healthcare, government, education, technology, manufacturing, and numerous SMBs were all part of the Ghost ransomware attack spree that began early in 2021. CISA, the FBI, and the MSISAC said in a joint advisory on Wednesday that the indiscriminate targeting of networks containing vulnerabilities has led to the compromise of organizations across more than 70 countries, including some in China. Woohoo, really? Talk about not discriminating against your host nation. Ghost ransomware operators frequently rotate their malware executables. They change the file extensions of encrypted files and the contents of their ransom notes. So they're constantly moving and they're linked like Ghost, Cringe, Cryptor, Phantom Strike, Hello, Wicker Me, HS Harada, and Rapture. They're pretty much all the same group. They're using the same thing. They're just varying it out to keep law enforcement off their feet. Again, the decentralized nature of cybercrime makes it much more difficult to track through traditional means of law enforcement. It requires a whole new thing. So, to defend against ghost ransomware, defenders are advised to take the following measures: make regular offsite backups that can be encrypted by ransomware, cold storage, hot storage offline. Patch operating system software and firmware vulnerabilities as soon as possible. Focus on security flaws that have been targeted by the ghost ransomware group. Those are the Fortinet, Cold Fusion, and Exchange CVE. Some of these from 2018, some from 2010, some from 2009 and 2021. Segment networks to limit lateral movement from infected devices. Network segmentation and network microsegmentation have now become a standard part of everything you do. If you're not doing it and you need some help, maybe I'll do a segment on that. And enforce phishing resistance, MFA, for all privileged accounts and email services accounts. So there's that there. The Australian intelligence are projecting that foreign nations will increasingly attempt to sabotage the country's critical infrastructure. Mike Burgess, the Director General of Security in charge of the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, delivered an annual threat assessment encompassing that many national security threats facing Australia. Among the most important, he noted, are the ways in which foreign threat actors are weaponizing AI-enabled disinformation and deepfakes, military espionage, and attacks against critical infrastructure that could cause damage to the military, government, and even some social cohesion. The ASIO report reflects an increasingly combative international relation environment, increasing competition between great powers, and Australia's position in all of this, one of which is both strategically critical and geographically fragile. So we'll see the threat to Australia's military. Burgess has made 6 threat assessments since taking office, none quite like his latest. This one seems to be kind of like, we're at the end of the world. Australia is kind of right there at the tip of it, but the world's not flat, it's round, and you can keep going around. And so sometimes you're down, sometimes you're up, but at the end of the day, you're still moving, and keep moving, baby. That's the whole point of what we do in cyber. Continue to move, continue to rotate, never stop. AI is obviously being a source for a lot of people, but it's always it's mind-boggling for me whenever I see government officials talk about these great threats, and then they put disinformation and misinformation, because that civilians don't trust the government. Like, if you've been in government your whole life, and you live in that Virginia bubble that I was in yesterday, and in some world of yours, you think that people trust you. No, your neighbors trust you because you're their neighbor and you happen to work for the government and they feel they have an insider. People outside of that bubble, and why the Washington, D.C. bubble should be broken up, is because people inherently don't trust government. So whenever government comes up and you're leading with misinformation and disinformation, you're going to turn people off. And cybersecurity people have that tendency. Let's talk about disinformation and misinformation. Full stop. We can talk about it in the private sector. The government should stay away from it. Let the private sector deal with misinformation and disinformation, because in the world of free speech, good ideas win, bad ideas lose over time. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. I've actually got a prime example of how good ideas will win and bad ideas will always lose. Burgess, speaking about great threats coming from international nation states targeting their critical infrastructure. Absolutely, that is going to happen. And when that does happen, Mr. Burgess, you ought to be on your P's and Q's. You've got to build private and public relationships that last in Australia. You got to empower your businesses to succeed, and your political class has got to be able to go after the nation states that host these types of attacks in order to decrease their frequency and impact. And that's all got to be part of a greater plan. And unfortunately for the folks here and in Australia, that doesn't seem to be quite sinking in. Katie Arrington, the former CISO at the Air Force and at the M&A office for the DoD, is back in her natural spot, the Pentagon. The DoD has now a new capable CISO in place. I've been a bit weary about some of the appointments being done in cybersecurity. This has reinvigorated to see Katie back in the Pentagon. For those who don't know Katie has led a lot of initiatives in her time in the military. She was kind of forced out by the previous administration. I'm not going to get into that aspect of it. This article kind of, does that for you. And it's very kind of biased in the way they describe Katie. Katie's accomplished. She understands cyber. She understands national defense. She's a patriot. She's approachable. She's everything you want of a cybersecurity professional. And so good for Katie. Great job by SecDev Hexath in bringing Katie back to the Pentagon. She's got a tough road ahead of her. Obviously, we're cutting military spending and military budgets, but that doesn't mean we're going to be insecure. And that's one of the things I see here is if we don't spend more money, we're not going to be as secure. Paladin's CTO said something the other day, and even yesterday at an event that I was at in DC, they go, look, you can make new propulsions for a tenth of the price of what they're buying them for today because of tech advancements. So cutting the budget doesn't necessarily mean less security. It may actually mean we're able to buy the newer stuff that's more that's more affordable, that's more budget friendly, that can do a lot more than some of these legacy old systems that a lot of those buildings, as you're driving from, Dulles Airport to the city or vice versa, or if you're going to Reagan, you see all the different logos on there of all these different companies that have sold these multi-million-dollar weapons. And, you see some of the new tech and you go, that's a tenth of the price. So just saying, I'm not there. All right. That's it for the cyber part. So if you want to drop now, you can, because I'm leaving cyber. So just saying that, giving everyone a warning. We're going to talk about Hamas and Gaza. So if you're watching, I've got the Wall Street Journal here. I'm going to play this. The slimy of all people, these absolutely ruthless killers who kidnapped Shiri Bibas, 9-month-old Kfir, and 4-year-old Ariel, who are now coming back as dead hostages. They were kidnapped alive, and you can see the video if you're watching right now from the Wall Street Journal. They were kidnapped from their home. There's the look of scream, that look that Shiri Bibas gives in the video by her captures as she was being captured, as her husband, who was released a few weeks ago, who came home to hoping that his wife and 2 sons would come back. They've come back, just not in the way any of us wanted. Kfir and Ariel Bibas were murdered in captivity. And by the way, these are not Hamas fighters. If you're watching this video, these are civilians. They're not wearing the Hamas Nakba uniforms. No. The people that kidnapped the Bibas families were civilians from Gaza. Civilians. This is, by the way, Yarden Bibas. This is also Oded Lifshitz, who was also kidnapped and killed, murdered in cold blood in captivity, 84 years old. Oded Lifshitz's crime, by the way, when he was alive and building Nero's, he used to drive sick Gazans to Israeli hospitals to get treatments. I'll tell you right now, there's no way in hell a sick Gazan makes it to an Israeli hospital anymore. There's no way. It's just not happening. They did a whole thing on every coffin, putting pictures on him saying, prisoners released, captured on October 7th. Prisoners. You captured a 9-month-old and a 4-year-old prisoners. And then when the IDF came, you hid behind your civilians. So my guess is Israel's going back to war. There's going to be another release of 6 additional hostages. There's about 40 or 50 additional hostages that are still alive in Gaza. There's either going to be one big trade for all of them, and Israel's going to release a whole bunch of people. In order to release a 9-month-old body and a 4-year-old body, Israel had to release 200 prisoners. 200 prisoners for dead bodies of civilians that were kidnapped alive, murdered in cold blood. Murdered in cold blood. It's a rough day for people. My wife, my family, myself, friends, anyone I've spoken to in Israel, since the news broke out yesterday that Hamas earlier this week said they're releasing their bodies. Some people did not want to believe it. We are all Bibas. We are all Bibas families. And there's no justification at all. None whatsoever. And if our values don't match, feel free to unfollow, unsubscribe, move on. But Hamas will be destroyed. These people cannot stay in Gaza. The Trump plan needs to go in full effect. There were civilians, women and children, watching them release these dead bodies. They did a whole ceremony. And the International Red Cross, shame on you, $1 from me you will never see ever again in your life. In fact, when I see the Red Cross, I'll cross the street. Won't be a part of your shenanigans ever again. The international world, former President Joe Biden, Prime Minister Netanyahu, disappointed an entire nation by not demanding the release of all these hostages on October 8th, or else. Now, the Bibas family comes back shattered. By the way, Shiri's parents killed on October 7th. The family dog killed on October 7th. Yarden Bibas comes back after 480 some odd days in Hamas captivity, abused, beaten, starved to death. And today, he received the bodies of his wife and 2 sons that he now gets to take them, bury them, and then somehow continue on with life. And I don't know how he's going to do it. My prayers are with Yarden Bibas. My prayers and thoughts are with Yarden Bibas, because I don't know what I would do if I was in his shoes. I don't know. No. It's been on my heart. I wanted to do it at the end of the show. But, man, Gaza needs to be emptied out. Emptied out completely. There can never be peace with people like that. Ever. It's just indoctrination, hatred. They need to be gone. The Trump plan needs to happen. Whether Egypt wants to play ball, doesn't want to play ball. There's nations that will take these Gazans. Some of them deserve a better life. Some of them deserve, every single one that was part of October 7th, that supported October 7th, deserves to meet a rough ending to their life, like the Bibas family just did. I mean, Israel is broken today. If you work with Israeli or Jewish friends today, today's the day to just slightly reach out, just offer words of support, because every wind inside of us, every little thing. I've been wearing this since October, since these came out. Our hearts are in Gaza, and our hearts will always stay in Gaza, because we'll never forget these 2 beautiful redheaded children. Shir Bibas, 9-month-old when he was kidnapped, never got to celebrate his first birthday. In captivity, murdered in cold blood with his mom and his older brother Ariel, who was only 4 years old. May their memory be a blessing. May we destroy Hamas and all other evil factions there. May there be no memory of them at all, ever. That's it for our show this morning. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back Monday with a whole lot more. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and most importantly, y'all, stay cyber safe.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.